Have you really thought about what it would take to fake a moon landing? Because the rocket did launch. We all saw the rocket launch, okay? So there's hardware there. They're like office buildings of blueprints for the design of the Saturn V rocket. The hundreds of engineering hours that went behind this and the records of those designs. If you wanted to fake the moon landing, you would have to fake all of these documents. And it just seems to me, it's way easier to just go to the moon. Has anyone considered that? Just go to the moon. That's easier than faking all of this.
Prove that the moon landings are real. You just look at any photograph taken by modern spacecraft, for example, which are not American spacecraft, if you want to be really conspiratorial about it. We have photographs of the landing sites with the stuff there. And I've met several of the people that worked on the moon. I've been very lucky to do so. And they are undoubtedly not bullshitters.
What did he say?
You can see it.
Moses, I don't think Brian Cox had it in him to speak like that. But I guess all you need to do to make Brian Cox swear is just say something incredibly stupid. Like, NASA faked the moon landings. Welcome back to part 2 of the conspiracy theory that makes absolutely no sense when you actually think about it. In the last video, we didn't only prove that context is so important, we also proved that the moon landings happened. But since context is so important, let's start at the beginning so we can have a better understanding of why JFK wanted to go to the moon and cover some highlights of the space race along the way. And since the space race took a good couple of years, this is probably going to be quite a long story. So I will make a part 3 which will just be my top 10 reasons NASA could not have faked the moon landings. But for today, let's just take a look at the space race because there is so much shit in there that proves that this was not fake. So let's go back in time for a quick little bit of history. According to the website Britannica, quote, following the surrender of Nazi Germany May 1945 near the close of the Second World War, the uneasy wartime alliance between the United States and Great Britain on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other began to unravel. By 1948, the Soviets had installed left-wing governments in the countries of Eastern Europe that had been liberated by the Red Army. The Americans and the British then began to fear the permanent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the threat of Soviet-influenced communist parties coming to power in the democracies of Western Europe. The Soviets, on the other hand, were determined to maintain control of Eastern Europe in order to safeguard against any possible renewed threat from Germany, and they were intent on spreading communism worldwide, largely for ideological reasons. This is what led to the Cold War, which had solidified by about 1947-1948, when US aid provided under the Marshall Plan to Western Europe had brought those countries under American influence, and the Soviets had installed openly communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Now, in this period of time, the Soviets unsuccessfully blockaded the western-held sectors of West Berlin, and the United States and its European allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is otherwise known as NATO, a unified military command formed to resist the Soviet presence in Europe. And then, in about 1949, the Soviets exploded their first atomic warhead, thus ending the American monopoly on the atomic bomb. Now, the term Cold War was first used by the English writer George Orwell in an article published in about 1945 to refer to what he predicted would be a nuclear stalemate between 2 or 3 monstrous superstates, who each possessed a weapon by which millions of people can be wiped out in a few seconds. End quote. So as we can see, the Soviet Union was rapidly improving their technology. And then, on October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first ever artificial Earth satellite. And coincidentally, they launched the space race as well. Now, Sputnik was groundbreaking in that it proved that artificial human-made objects could successfully exist in space, and it shifted space exploration from theoretical science to reality, and that's really cool. And then about a month later, the Soviets launched their second satellite into orbit, very creatively named Sputnik 2. And that was so cool that America was like, okay, just wait a goddamned minute here. We want to do some space shit too. And so they formed NASA. NASA was a direct response to these satellites sent up by the Soviets. And the American president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, asked Congress to pass legislation to create a civilian space agency to oversee the nation's space activities. They signed it, and NASA would officially start on October 1st, 1958. However, the Soviets were really fucking good at what they were doing, so they basically dominated the space race as if they were Brock Lesnar in a Cruiserweight Royal Rumble. Or Brock Lesnar just in a normal Royal Rumble. Anyway, the Soviet Union were the first to send an animal into space. Although I don't really like to talk about what happened to Laika the dog, so I just tell myself that they sent Laika into a film studio, gave her treats, and then hid her from the public for the rest of her life. The Soviets were also the first to send a man into space, Yuri Gagarin. He was launched on April 12, 1961, and was the first human ever to go into what could be considered space. The Soviets also sent the First Lady into space, Valentina Tereshkova, and she was launched into space on June 16, 1963. The Soviets were also first to send a man-made object to the moon, as well as something that touched the moon's surface, although touching is kind of a weird way to describe crashing, but to be fair, the Luna 2 probe was intentionally crashed on the moon. Probably because they hadn't quite worked out how to land something softly yet. And then, on February 3rd, 1966, the Soviet Union launched the probe Luna 9, which would become the first man-made object to land on the moon softly. So as you can see, the Soviets were the Brock Lesnar of the space world. But I do need to make this clear. NASA was able to very quickly follow these achievements made by the Soviets by repeating them. They weren't necessarily first, but they weren't necessarily far off either. For example, NASA would softly land their first probe on the moon on June 2nd, 1966. So only about 4 months after the Soviets. So I hope that just kinda clarifies where NASA was in their technology at the time. And unfortunately it needs to be said because there's a lot of stupid fucking people out there. Just because the Soviet Union did it first doesn't mean NASA couldn't do it. They were just a little bit behind in the space race, and arguably the arms race too. But they were able to quickly catch up, hence the nuclear stalemate. So I just wanted to make that clear because I know some green code is probably thinking, geez, how did NASA launch someone to the moon on the first try before even sending a satellite? Or some stupid shit like that. The 11-year time span between being established and landing on the moon was spent by conducting numerous different experiments and missions, and thousands of people spending thousands of hours on planning and designing the technology. It didn't happen overnight. Anyway, it's time to get back to the Cold War stuff now. Back in October 1957, so around the exact same time the Soviets launched their first satellite Sputnik, the Soviet Union also conducted the world's first successful test of an intercontinental ballistic missile. Very scary shit, because it was considered capable of striking US territory with a nuclear payload. So, fears in the US due to this perceived threat became known as the missile gap. But the US always caught up quickly, and the first American ICBM, the Atlas missile, was tested in late 1958. So America, once again, caught up to the Soviets, and in doing so, this led to another intense stage of the Cold War. In 1962, the Soviets began secretly installing missiles in Cuba that could be used to launch nuclear attacks on US cities. Very scary shit. This sparked the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And this so-called confrontation brought the two superpowers to the brink of war before an agreement was reached to withdraw the missiles. Thankfully, the Cuban Missile Crisis kind of showed that neither the US nor the Soviet Union were ready to use nuclear weapons for fear of the other's retaliation. And as Dave Mustaine of Megadeth said,
Mutually assured destruction. Nice story. Tell it to Reader's Digest.
In case Megadeth ever needs a new vocalist, I am available. Yeah, whatever. The two superpowers soon signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which banned above-ground nuclear weapons testing. Very good. But this crisis also hardened the Soviets' determination never again to be humiliated by their military inferiority. And they began a build-up of both conventional and strategic forces that the United States was forced to match for the next 25 years. And that is a very brief and basic overview of the state of the world at the time. In a nutshell, it was a nuclear stalemate, and the Soviets were taking the world to Suplex City. So JFK, in his infinite wisdom, said if you want to keep taking us to Suplex City, you're gonna have to come get us from the moon. And so he came out and he made his famous speech.
Zombies. Gentlemen, at times like these, our capacity to retaliate must be and has to be massive to deter all forms of aggression. Gentlemen, lock and load.
Viva la revolución. Any last words, Mr. President?
Your president needs slugs.
Sorry, that was the wrong speech. He came out and made this one.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
And thus, the race to the moon began. Or did it? Because the Soviet government publicly denied participating in any such competition. However, it did come out in 1990 that they were secretly pursuing 2 programs to land people on the moon. So if you think about it, why America won is because they put all of their time and energy and resources into one goal. Put a person on the moon before the decade is out. The Soviets didn't necessarily do that. They had a whole bunch of shit that they were working on. But when you take a look back at NASA, almost 5% of the US federal budget was allocated to them. They were being given tons of money, and their only goal, once again, their only goal was to give their president slugs. No, put a person on the moon. Pretty simple to remember if you're not a nerd like me. Now, it's been estimated that in total, about 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program, including about 20,000 other industrial firms as well. So we are talking about a shit ton of people working on various different parts of the project. Now let me make this clear as well. The people building these parts were building these things to exact specifications that mathematically and irrefutably had the capability of carrying the assigned payload to the moon. So the greencoats who say that this was a hoax say that these 400,000 people didn't all need to know. So what the fuck were they doing then? All of these people were hired and contracted because of their skills, because of their knowledge, because of their craftsmanship, because they knew how to build these things. So if you think all these people were tricked into building something that actually had the capability of sending people to the moon, you are fucking delusional. There is too much involved here for this to be a hoax. You want to see what a cover-up looks like? Look at what's happening with the Epstein files. Think about the Johnson administration lying about the Vietnam War. Think about Watergate. Think about MK Ultra. All of those were exposed because there is a paper trail, because there is evidence. Why has that never happened with the moon landings? All 400,000 of these people, plus the 20,000 industrial firms as well, have never said anything about it being fake, except for Bill Casing, who got this fucking idea from a homeless heroin addict. And he left Rocketdyne 6 years before Apollo 11 landed on the moon. Now let's also just consider if these engineers and contractors were being tricked into building something that couldn't take people to the moon, why the fuck would they have several redesigns of the Saturn V rocket as well to improve it? This doesn't make sense. This doesn't make any sense at all. And people have taken all of these designs, scientists and enthusiasts, and they've done the maths and the calculations on these rockets, and everything always checks out. The fuel and the weight and the oxygen supply and everything about the Saturn V in this configuration, and all configurations, could put people on the moon. This is just ridiculous, man. But if you want to see the rockets explained very nicely, watch the video by the Everyday Astronaut, because he explains all the science and the math in extreme detail. Let's just move on. Now, at the same time, the Soviets were kinda sorta secretly trying to get a rocket ready as well for moon missions. But they encountered a couple of setbacks, like rockets exploding on the launch pad and so on. But they never really made these failures public at the time, and that's not really surprising. They also downplayed how serious Chernobyl was. Although Chernobyl wasn't really as bad as some people try to make it out to be, like half of Europe would have been inhospitable for 500,000 years, and people would have transformed into deathclaws and ghouls and shit like that.
I'd offer you one of these cherry tomatoes, but you got a hole in your neck.
Not necessarily the case. This is a photo of the Chernobyl dive team, also known as the Heroes of Ukraine, who went underneath the molten reactor to drain the bubbler pools before the molten core would touch that water and create a steam explosion that could have theoretically, maybe possibly, blown up all of the Chernobyl reactors. 2 of these guys are still alive today, and they were right underneath the reactor that was leaking nuclear material. Now, I am getting off track again, but I really just wanted an excuse to use Chernobyl Cat in a video, to be honest. But it does apply, because when you think of the Van Allen belts, which all these moon landing deniers have such an issue with, these guys at Chernobyl would have been exposed to more radiation than the astronauts going through the Van Allen belt. And 2 of these Chernobyl divers are still alive today. Well, anyway, brace yourselves, because I'm about to play a clip of Bart again.
The radiation belts are 250 times a lethal dose.
So that's one reason.
Okay, where can we, this is on your website, where can we find this quote?
What's the purpose of this discussion?
Now, the Orion mission sent up Geiger counters into the radiation belts in 2014, unmanned, and they registered the radiation. I called NASA. I said, I'm a journalist. This is a non-military, taxpayer-funded scientific mission. Can I please have the Geiger counter readings? They told me that was classified. They weren't able to tell me. Now, when NASA sent probes to the sun to find out the temperature of the sun, the temperature wasn't classified. And when they sent probes to Jupiter to measure the amount of helium in Jupiter's atmosphere, the amount wasn't classified. So why would the amount of radiation inside the radiation belts and a spacecraft intending to one day send people to the moon, why would that radiation measurement be a classified secret?
Charlie, do you know why that would be classified?
I didn't realize it was.
So I would imagine that if it was classified, we would classify it because we wouldn't want the Soviets or the Chinese to know the actual level of radiation. Like, if you guys want to figure it out, find your own.
What is the point of this discussion?
So what this guy fails to realize is the people behind the Apollo program figured out the best and quickest and safest way to get through the Van Allen belts. On average, each mission spent about 1 hour in these radiation belts, each way. And I don't know what the fuck Orion has to do with anything here, but here's the actual average radiation readings from the Apollo missions. They're all out there for anyone to see who just goes to look for it. Now, according to the Institute of Physics, quote, readings from the 9 Apollo missions that reached the moon showed that the astronauts' average radiation exposure was only 0.46 rads, which, by the way, is nowhere near 250 times the lethal limit. Giving the benefit of the doubt, and that is what scientists assumed, then this proved that NASA was right to shield the astronauts from the radiation. Now, here's just a very basic explanation. So the command module's hull was built out of aluminum, and aluminum is often preferred in aerospace applications because it's lightweight, it's strong, and it's durable. And not only that, but it also offers modest protection against cosmic radiation in space environments. So it was kind of like a give and take situation here. It didn't block all of the radiation, the astronauts obviously still were exposed to radiation, but it did the fucking job. because the hive mind behind Apollo were able to determine the quickest and safest way through the Van Allen belt. So at the end of the day, the average radiation exposure that they received was 0.46 rads. That is less than what is experienced by some nuclear energy workers. Just the regular ones. We're not even talking about the divers at Chernobyl here. But just to put it into perspective, 0.46 rads is about 10 X-rays. So yeah, man, what the fuck is the purpose of this discussion? Why aren't you looking further into Chernobyl to say, oh, Chernobyl never happened because these divers are still alive? They were lying. The only diver out of the 3 who passed away, Boris Baranov, passed away from a heart attack, not acute radiation sickness, and he passed away 20 years after Chernobyl exploded. But we don't hear Bart talking about Chernobyl. Anyway, Apollo. I think it's quite interesting to look at each Apollo mission to see what they were actually trying to do, and all the steps taken to make it possible for Apollo 11 to land. So let's start with Apollo 1. On February 21st, 1967, Apollo 1 was prepping to be the first crewed mission of the Apollo program. Apollo 1 would have been the first low Earth orbital test of the Apollo Command and Service Module. For reference, that's the module that orbited the moon, waiting for the 2 astronauts from the moon to ascend back up and then dock in lunar orbit. They would rendezvous and then they would return to Earth. So Apollo 1 was a crewed mission to simply test the Command and Service Module while in orbit around the Earth. However, this mission never flew. I'm probably going to read the quote that you see on the screen wrong again, but yeah, I'm sorry. On January 27th, 1967, a cabin fire during a launch rehearsal test killed all 3 of the crew members. Commander Pilot Gus Grisham, Senior Pilot Ed White, and Pilot Roger B. Chaffee, and this fire destroyed the Command and Service Module as well. Now the name Apollo 1, which was chosen by the astronauts, was made the official name of the program by NASA in their honor after the fire. Now obviously, Apollo 1 is a very important part of the story, so let's go over this one carefully. Quote, immediately after the fire, NASA convened an accident review board to determine the cause of the fire, and both chambers of the United States Congress conducted their own committee inquiries to oversee NASA's investigation. Ultimately, the ignition source of the fire was determined to be electrical, and the fire spread rapidly due to combustible nylon material and the high-pressure pure oxygen cabin atmosphere. Unfortunately, rescue was prevented by the plug door hatch, which could not be opened against the internal pressure of the cabin. Now, because the rocket was unfueled, the test had not been considered hazardous, and emergency preparedness for it was poor. During the congressional investigation, Senator Walter Mondale, I'm not really sure how to pronounce that, publicly revealed a NASA internal document citing problems with prime Apollo contractor North American Aviation, which became known as the Phillips Report. So again, you want to talk about a fucking cover-up, think about the Phillips Report. That wasn't fucking covered up, that was exposed. But sure, 400,000 people kept this secret.
Hold up, wait a minute.
Alright, so what is the Phillips Report? Well, the Phillips Report was a highly critical internal NASA document produced between November and December 1965 by a team led by Lieutenant General Samuel C. Phillips. Now, this report investigated severe management, technical, and quality assurance failures at North American Aviation, again, the prime contractor for the Apollo Command and Service Module, as well as the second stage of the Saturn V rocket. So, not good. In late 1965, NASA was facing major schedule slippages and cost overruns with NAA, or as I like to call them, nah mate. So General Phillips led a Tiger team to investigate why the contractor was underperforming. The report highlighted a dangerous situation where nah mate could not manage costs, schedules, or technical performance. So Lieutenant General Sam Phillips sent a scathing letter to nah mate's president, Lee Atwood, demanding immediate major changes. And the Phillips Report's findings led to an immediate restructuring of management at North American Aviation. Now, NASA Administrator James E. Webb did not disclose the report to Congress at the time, saying that this was confidential. It was an internal contractor management matter. However, once it was exposed, this disclosure embarrassed NASA Administrator James E. Webb and attracted a lot of controversy to the Apollo program as well. Now, just think of how few people were involved with that, and it still got exposed.
Hold up. Wait a minute.
Now, despite congressional displeasure at NASA's lack of openness, both congressional committees concluded that the specific issues in the 1965 Phillips report did not directly cause the 1967 Apollo 1 accident. So yeah, I think we can all agree that there was a little fuckery here, but it got exposed, as would the moon landings if they had been hoaxed. But I think I've now beaten this horse to death, and you get the point. Now, understandably, the Apollo 1 tragedy caused the entire Apollo program to stall, and rightfully so. Crewed Apollo flights were now suspended for 20 months, so almost 2 years. So the most realistic time frame for landing somebody on the moon would have been very late 1968 or sometime in 1969, which is exactly what happened. But absolutely fucking disgustingly, grifters and greencoats claim that NASA or even the CIA killed the Apollo 1 astronauts because they did not believe getting to the moon was actually possible.
What in the fuck are you doing?
Fuck off, will you?
Fuck off!
However, since this claim is propagated by people like Bart Sobral, we know already that it's bullshit. Check out Dave McKeegan's video on exposing Bart Sobral's lies. Now, according to Bart, he said that Gus's wife said that she spoke with Gus the day the fire happened. And he said some shit about there's CIA people walking around the launch pad, and he's never seen them before and it's very weird. I highly doubt that's true, because Gus's wife herself said that she last spoke to him several days before the fire happened. Once that was proven, Bart then changed his script to say that Gus's wife actually spoke to him several days before it happened. So that's just kind of a little indication of how many things this guy says is actually correct. But to all the people that use their brains, this is probably going to make perfect sense to you. If NASA was planning on hoaxing the moon landings, and the entire point of hoaxing them was winning the space race against the Soviets, why in the blue flaming fucking hell would they deliberately sabotage their own program? I can think of 100 other ways to deal with astronauts who are supposedly saying getting to the moon is not possible, and I'm not even half as smart as the people who worked at NASA. Here is just a few examples. Fire them, and I didn't realize how fucking bad that would have sounded up until I just said it, but I obviously mean dismiss them from duty. Declare these astronauts insane. How about this one? Send them to the fucking moon so they can actually say holy shit, it was possible. And that's just a couple off the top of the dome. But Gus Grisham never said going to the moon was impossible. If we want to be really nitpicky, what he said just moments before the accident was how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings? I don't really know how you can misinterpret that. It's true that he was cynical. I mean, he's the guy that put the lemon on top of the command and service module, but he never said it wasn't possible. And if you are NASA or the government and you have an astronaut saying this kind of shit, why kill them? Death tends to attract a lot of attention. So again, I have to ask, why fake this? This story doesn't make NASA look particularly good. And again, for people trying to deceive the world by hoaxing the moon landings, this is not helping. You have to be a special kind of stupid to interpret this as a murder to cover up being exposed for hoaxing the moon landings. Now, before I get called insensitive or some shit for saying that, because according to Gollum, that's what Gus Grisham's family believes.
What is reliable is Betty Grissom and Scott Grissom, who told me he was Gus Grissom, their husband and father, was going to be the first man on the moon. He was a whistleblower at NASA to such a degree that he got Secret Service protection up until the day of his death. And they both say he was murdered by the CIA. So why is the CIA killing Apollo astronauts? Right? Who are whistleblowers at NASA. That's not my opinion. That's the opinion of the dead man's relatives.
That's completely understandable because they went through something traumatic and that's their way of dealing with the grief. However, Betty Grisham, Gus's wife, never said, publicly at least, that Gus was murdered. She did, though, sue NASA over negligence. Gus Grisham publicly spoke about his safety concerns with the Apollo capsule. And he was right about it. His son, though, Scott Grisham, was about 5 years old when this accident happened. And Scott Grisham, as far as I understand, has actually publicly said that he believes his father was murdered. He believes that the capsule was sabotaged. He then pressed for another investigation into this incident. He also did his own investigation into this incident, and he believed that he came up with some evidence. However, it doesn't seem like he did. So nothing has really changed regarding the cause of the fire. I just read something about a NASA inspector named Thomas Barron who wrote a 500-page report criticizing the safety flaws of the capsule, and shortly after writing that report, he died in a car accident. That's really sad, but I struggle to understand why people would think that Thomas Barron was also murdered when NASA themselves, in the fucking Phillips report, also stated their concerns with North American aviation. The Apollo 1 incident sucks. Betty Grisham sued for negligence and she won the case. And I understand Scott Grisham trying to deal with his grief. But the evidence clearly states that it was an accident. And to accuse NASA of murdering these astronauts, you're gonna need a little more evidence than the, I suppose, thought that using a 100% pure oxygen environment inside the capsule wasn't necessary for this test. Of course it was. The fuck do you think they were gonna be breathing up in space? That is where this capsule was gonna go. NASA needed to test everything before landing on the moon. Otherwise, what do you think they were doing? Just playing around. It sucks, and I feel for Scott Grisham, but it was an accident. Also, don't fucking put words in Betty Grisham's mouth. But yeah, let's just move on. Now, because of the Apollo 1 tragedy, Apollo 2 and Apollo 3 were skipped. Their missions would have been to conduct more test flights of the Apollo capsule, focusing on the service propulsion system burns and docking maneuvers. However, this was no longer necessary, since the entire Apollo capsule had to be redesigned after the Apollo 1 incident. So, chronologically, the next mission was Apollo 4, and this mission started on November 9th, 1967, and it was the crucial first unmanned test flight of the Saturn V rocket. Apollo 4 was the first test where all three stages of the rocket flew together, and this is also the test that proved that this rocket could safely take people to the moon and back. Its heat shield was successful, and its engines proved that they could restart in space. Obviously, a very important thing, because we'd hate for radiation to eat through our equipment and be stranded in space. So Apollo 4 was very important, successful, and restored confidence in the space program following the Apollo 1 incident. The next mission was Apollo 5, which was an unmanned Earth orbit mission launched on January 22, 1968. And this mission served as the critical first flight test of the Apollo lunar module. It tested both the module's ascent and descent propulsion systems, including a fire-in-the-hole emergency staging test, which basically was firing the ascent engine while still attached to the descent stage. Because of course, we'd hate for the equipment to fail and the astronauts get stranded on the moon. So, if you ever hear a green coat saying something to the effect of NASA didn't ever test the lunar ascent stage, they are talking absolute fucking dog shit, because that is what Apollo 5 did. The next mission was Apollo 6, and this was yet another unmanned mission with the purpose of testing the Saturn V's ability to launch the Apollo spacecraft into a trans-lunar trajectory. Now, I've got a long quote with a lot of space jargon here, so brace yourself. The flight plan called for, following trans-lunar injection, a direct return abort using the service module's main engine with a flight time totaling about 10 hours. However, vibrations damaged some of the Rocketdyne J2 engines in the second and third stages by rupturing internal fuel lines, causing a second stage engine to shut down early. And if I may just be an asshole for a second, if by chance Bill Casing actually did get this moon hoax shit from some person who worked at Rocketdyne, I don't think I'm too out of line by saying that maybe they weren't the best people to comment on the situation, given that Apollo 6 had an engine failure. And that was in 1968. 5 years after Bill Casing left. However, this is the purpose of test flights without a crew of astronauts, so that you can find problems, troubleshoot, and diagnose. But whatever, I'm sure I'm just preaching to the choir. Back to Apollo 6. So after that second stage engine shut down early, an additional second stage engine also shut down early due to cross-wiring with the engine that had shut it down. But impressively, the rocket's onboard guidance system compensated by burning the second and third stages longer, although the resulting parking orbit was more elliptical than planned. And then, the damaged third stage engine failed to restart for translunar injection, so the flight controller solved the problem by choosing to repeat the flight profile of the previous Apollo 4 test, and they then achieved a high orbit and a high-speed return. It's amazing what people can do when they use their brains. Now, despite the engine failures, the flight provided NASA with enough confidence to use the Saturn V for crewed launches. And so, the third uncrewed mission that they had planned was cancelled. It was now time to send some astronauts. Now, after training for several years, astronauts Walter Schirra, Don Eisel, and Walter Cunningham, who would have been the team for the cancelled Apollo 2, were selected to pilot Apollo 7. Now, Apollo 7 was the first crewed mission of the Apollo program, and their mission was to test the new Block 2 Command and Service Module just in orbit around the Earth for 11 days. While up there in space, Walter, Don, and Walter became the first astronauts to broadcast live TV from a US crewed spacecraft. So that's pretty cool. But even cooler than that, they also successfully performed a rendezvous maneuver with a piece of their own discarded rocket booster, which, of course, cemented in the minds of everyone in the Apollo program that landing on the moon, launching off the moon, reconnecting with the command and service module in lunar orbit, and restarting the engines to return home was all possible. So if I may stop reading to be an asshole again, do you see how all of this makes sense? And the only way you can think there was any fuckery with the moon landings here is if you don't know shit about it. The Apollo missions took years of training and planning. They didn't just launch Neil and Buzz to the moon all willy-nilly. It took fucking years. But preaching to the choir. Now moving along to Apollo 8, the mission that, in my opinion, doesn't get the respect, credit, or attention it deserves. Because this is the first time that human beings went all the way to the moon. They didn't land, but they went all the way to the moon.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
So, on December 21st, 1968, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders became the first crewed spacecraft to leave Earth's orbit, reach the moon, orbit it, and return home safely. So this was the first time that NASA and the US beat the Soviet Union at anything space-related. It was also the first human spaceflight to leave Earth's gravity, the first time the far side of the moon was seen by human eyes, and the mission where the iconic Earthrise photograph comes from. And to all the people that say that NASA fucked with some photographs or edited them or faked some of them, if you look through the Apollo 8 gallery, you'll see just how many attempts they actually took to take this photo. A lot of them are blurry, a lot of them are cropped weird because the astronauts didn't have a viewfinder in the Hasselblad cameras that they took with them. So they're actually quite lucky that they captured this photo. So it doesn't really appear, in my opinion, that they faked any photos. But anyway, Frank, Jim, and Will orbited the moon about 10 times during their 6-day mission, and on Christmas Eve, they set up a live TV broadcast and read from the book of Genesis. Apollo 8 then returned on December 27, 1968, and safely splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. A couple months later, on March 3, 1969, NASA launched Apollo 9, and their mission was a critical 10-day Earth orbital mission that served as the first crewed flight of all Apollo lunar hardware, including the lunar module. Astronauts James McDivitt, Russell Schweickart, and David Scott tested docking maneuvers and the lunar module systems in space, ensuring that the spacecraft was ready for the lunar landing. So far, we have a very normal, very natural progression in the Apollo program's mission to land a person on the moon. And so far, nothing sounds too outrageous. Each mission was one small step closer to their goal. And the next one, Apollo 10, was just as important as Apollo 7, Apollo 8, and arguably Apollo 11. On May 18, 1969, Apollo 10 launched and effectively served as the final dress rehearsal for the Apollo 11 moon landing. After the spacecraft reached lunar orbit, astronaut John Young remained in the command and service module, while astronauts Thomas Stafford and Gene Cernan flew the Apollo lunar module to about within 14.4 kilometers above the lunar surface. Now 14.4 kilometers or 9 miles was the point at which powered descent for landing would begin on a landing mission. Now while orbiting at this height, they mapped the location for the Apollo 11 landing site in the Sea of Tranquility. Now, Thomas and Gene were able to take low-altitude, high-resolution photographs and conducted visual reconnaissance from the lunar module, literally laying the groundwork to make it possible for Apollo 11 to land. So after they joined back up with John Young, they orbited the moon a total of 31 times and then they returned home safely to Earth. Now let's just take a quick break to talk about the 14.4 kilometers. 14.4 kilometers is about 47,244 feet. In the first part of this series, I showed this satellite image. This image was taken at 72,000 feet. Now, as you can see, there's a distinct difference between the images that satellites take and what Apollo's special Hasselblad cameras took. Now, I'm not saying that you can't get these photos any other way, but I can't find any other clear photos like this taken by a satellite. They're just too far up and they don't have the same kind of camera, because a satellite's job is a little bit different. Now, I also can't find any photos like this from the Soviets' lunar missions. So logically, if the satellite photos look different, and NASA claims that they got these photos by sending people to the moon with special Hasselblad cameras, and the photos that the astronauts took match the videos, match the topography of the moon captured by satellites, it stands to reason that these photos are real. But I know that some people think that these are fake, either by some miraculous kind of CGI, or they were using miniatures or some shit. However, a miniature to this scale is not a miniature. It's a fucking gargantua, and this thing had to have been built somewhere. So where was it built? It's all well and good to say the photos are fake, but then you need to explain how. So good luck explaining how they recorded these sprawling moonscapes that just go on for fucking ever. This supposed miniature moon would have to be as big as a fucking city so they could get all the details and craters and lights and shadows and shit like that. And since you're working with miniature, you're going to need to control the lighting to get realistic shadows. So then you're going to need a ceiling over your set and a single light source so powerful it can evenly and globally light the surface. And I have to emphasize this, but you're going to need to make sure that it's a single light source, because otherwise you're going to have multiple shadows like on a football field. However, the big problem here is the only light source like that exists is the fucking sun. So if this was a miniature, it is a massive miniature the size of the moon. Because it was the moon. And we can say that because we actually see the craft touch down and the astronauts get out. There is no other explanation for this other than Apollo 16 in this video that I have playing landed on the moon. If you can't believe your own eyes and reason with yourself that nothing else makes sense, there is no hope for you. Anyway, the reason I went on about this is because it ties back to my original point. Landing an unmanned probe on the moon is cool and shit, but my point was, satellite photos look like shit. They are impressive, don't get me wrong, they're impressive, but they aren't very clear, like the Hasselblad camera pictures. So, in order for Apollo 11 to land exactly where they planned to land during Apollo 11 would have been very difficult. But to the degree of accuracy that is perfectly matched up in both the photos and satellites is impossible. There would have been some mistake. In this case, what we are really saying here is it would be easier to land on the moon than actually fake it. Neil Armstrong himself rated the difficulty of just landing on the moon a 13 out of 10. And this is a man who understands math.
I got 141 2/3 chance.
Now how about landing in a precise location so that you can hoax this whole thing for fucking years, because eventually satellites are going to fly overhead and they're going to capture the positions of everything, and you're piloting this fucking probe from Earth with like 200 ping. If you've played online multiplayer games, you know what I'm talking about with the ping. And actually, since they're on the moon, they're playing with 1,300 ping, because that is how long it takes a radio signal to reach the moon from Earth. Can you fucking imagine landing a probe with 1,300 ping? And everything just somehow lines up perfectly as you had rebuilt it on Earth so that you could fake this entire thing. Bullshit. The only way that this would have been possible is if Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins successfully landed Apollo 11 on the moon. And since I was just on the topic of photos and everything, I feel like this is a good time to just mention this briefly. I've seen a few people say that they believe the moon landings happened, but NASA faked some or all of the photos. I don't really think so. I don't really think so, but I understand where that thought comes from. And that thought comes from some greencoats who have said that the radiation would have destroyed the film. So again, these Hasselblad cameras were specifically and specially designed cameras for the moon missions. This isn't shit that you can just walk into a department store and buy. This was specifically made for NASA. And since NASA are the people who figured out how to get to the moon, I'm sure they can figure out how to protect a camera from radiation. They figured out how to protect their rockets and their spacecrafts and their astronauts from radiation. Why not a camera? Another thing that needs to be made clear is that NASA do edit some of their photos or satellite images, and they say that quite openly. Sometimes things just need to be stitched together or cleaned up for media, and some people respond to that by saying, "How fucking dare you edit photos of space and the Earth?" As if no one edits their own photos for Facebook or Instagram. Let's just stop acting so high and mighty for a second, because if you want, you can see all the unedited Apollo photos on this website, March to the Moon. Now, I don't want to sound like an asshole too much in this video, but a lot of these photos are not professional photos. They're blurry, they're out of focus, they're of nothing, and that's because the Hasselblad cameras didn't have viewfinders. There are literally thousands upon thousands of photos on these websites, and NASA just selected to show the best ones. Now, with that all said, I think the one best piece of evidence that they didn't fake any photos is the fact that there are no photos of Neil Armstrong on the moon. None. Unless you count this one. The astronaut that you're seeing is Buzz Aldrin. This is Neil Armstrong. Now, another question that gets asked is, if Neil was taking the photo, where's the camera? He's holding it here. He's hip firing it like he's fucking Space Rambo or something. But I guess if anybody has earned the title of Space Rambo, it's Neil Armstrong. But anyway, my point here is that if NASA was going to fake any of the photos of the astronauts on the moon, do you not think that they would fake their golden goose on the moon? Just even like, I don't know, put some red commander stripes on Buzz's spacesuit and say, yeah, that one was Neil Armstrong. But they didn't do that. Neil Armstrong also didn't ask Buzz to take a photo of him on the moon either, because he just didn't care. That's just how Neil Armstrong was. But we'll talk more about Neil's personality later, because right now, I want to show you another photo that proves the moon landing happened. While walking around on the moon, Neil made his way over to the Little West crater. Now we can tell this crater is the same crater as in the satellite because of the shadow seen here, indicating a little dent or a crater inside the crater. Now you can even clearly see how this black line is formed. It comes from the pile of rocks down in the crater. Speaking of rocks, the first unmanned space probe to land on the moon, collect some samples and then return to Earth only happened 15 months after Apollo 11 landed on the moon. And you better believe that since the Soviets were beating the Americans in every aspect of the space race, up until of course Apollo 8, collecting lunar samples would have been something that they beat them at as well. But they didn't. Apollo 11 landed on the moon and brought back the first lunar samples. Does this all make sense so far? I know I was supposed to talk about Apollo 11 now, and I took one giant leap ahead.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
But these are important things to consider when you accuse NASA of faking the moon landings. It just goes to show that if you've read even just a little bit about the moon landings, you can say with absolute confidence that they absolutely happened. It's sad that videos like this about one of the greatest achievements in history must be made to prove it happened. It's sad that videos must be made debunking all the claims made by flat earthers and Holocaust deniers as well. It's sad that about 25% of the public are so against the idea of authority that they will willingly dismiss the evidence right in front of their eyes and are so willing to cause actual damage to society with the insane beliefs and misinformation that they spread. I mean, do you honestly think that this guy is saying all this shit for the good of the world? Or is there maybe a different motive here? Because as soon as you go over to his website that he keeps talking about, Sabrel.com, you'll see that he's selling a conspiracy theory book for children. This fucking book is about the moon people faking a trip to Earth because of political pressure and government corruption within their society. So that's fucking great, but when they grow just a little bit older, they can also order Aliens from Planet X, a book about a mysterious and dangerous 10th planet in the solar system that for some reason doesn't really orbit anything else like the moons orbit the planet or the planets orbit the sun. This thing is just passing by for some reason. And conspiracy theorists think that this thing is going to pass by in the near future. And this book reveals how corrupt world leaders may use the passing of Planet X for their long-planned revealing of aliens, which may actually be interdimensional beings rather than extraterrestrial. And oh my fucking god, these aliens have secretly been here for millennia, helping their kindred world leaders stay in power. So I guess this strategy is corrupt the children while they're young. Tell them about a story of the moon people faking an Earth landing because of political pressure and government corruption, and then you can sell them on other stupid bullshit like the fake moon landing and Planet X. So yeah, I'm sorry if I don't see the sincerity in Bart Sabrell's claims. But even if he was sincere and he wasn't doing this for any money at all, it doesn't change the fact that most of the things he always says are wrong. But if moonlanders really don't believe it, I have an idea. And I think you're gonna really like this idea. But there's 8.3 billion people in the world. So how about we all just chip in $1, American of course, and then we give that money to NASA, and we ask them to build a rocket. And then that rocket takes all of these conspiracy theorists to the moon so that they can see for themselves that not only is the Earth not flat, but that it's also possible to land on the moon. And then we leave them there. Don't worry, I'm just kidding. $1 per person in the world would not be enough money, because then we would only have $8.3 billion. And each Apollo mission cost way more than that, when adjusted for inflation of course. We're gonna need about $3.50 per person to make this work.
I said, damn it, monster, get off my lawn. I ain't giving you no $3.50. It said, how about just $2.50? I said, oh, now it's only $2.50. What is that, sale on Loch Ness Munchies or something?
What a clever little joke that was. Yeah, adjusted for inflation, Apollo 11 itself cost about $25-30 billion, somewhere around there. And that was only one mission to the moon that could only take 3 people at a time as well. Oh well, guess we're just gonna have to deal with the walking brain dead here on Earth a little longer. And hopefully one day,
we can all live together. Liar.
Anyways, let's just try to get back on track. I fucked up badly and I was supposed to tell you about the Apollo 11 landing. Instead I told you about fucking satellites and photos. And my Loch Ness Monster scheme. So anyway, after Apollo 10 was of course Apollo 11, and this is the mission that successfully landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Neil became the first man to moonwalk, Buzz became the first man to relieve himself on the moon, so he says, and Mike Collins became the loneliest man, or so people called him because he became the first man to orbit the moon alone. Now, Apollo 11 is not only one of the greatest achievements in history, it's also still one of the most watched live TV broadcasts of all time. In total, Apollo 11 spent 21 hours and 36 minutes on the moon, and Neil and Buzz walked around on the moon for about 2.5 hours. All of which was, of course, broadcast live back to Earth. And if you really think about it, $25-30 billion is an awful lot of money for an awfully short time on the moon. But it was to make history, and 600 million people tuned in to watch it happen live. Now, this moonwalk was broadcast back to Earth live via an SSTV camera. And the way this kind of camera, a slow scan television camera, operates is quite complicated, but you can of course read up more about it yourself. But basically, it sends signals back to Earth, which were then converted into video footage that appeared on people's TV screens. This means, and this is going to sound kind of stupid, but this means that people watched the astronauts walk on the moon while they were on the moon. Sounds kind of obvious, but there are people out there that think that this was pre-recorded here on Earth, and then broadcast up to the moon to be broadcast back down to Earth. Well, I've time-stamped a few great examples of the astronauts hopping about in moon gravity in the Apollo 11 live broadcast, and interestingly, this is something that has been proven by the Mythbusters and other people as well to not be possible with wires. Because wires on Earth will still give the distinct look of hopping with wires while you're affected by regular gravity. Something that most people, in fact, all people, are accustomed to seeing because we see it every day. So it's not something really easy or intuitive to fake. Anyway, I recommend that you watch the whole Mythbusters episode about the moon landing. But the conclusion that they came to about the kangaroo hop was the only way it would be possible to recreate this motion, on Earth at least, is with parabolic flights. Now, parabolic flights are performed by special aircraft that fly in parabolas to create brief periods of whatever weightlessness you are going for. So in this case, moon gravity, which is 1/6 the gravity of Earth, because the moon is about 6 times smaller than the Earth. So, if you think that this over 2-hour-long uncut continuous one-shot broadcast was shot like that, in a parabolic plane, you may as well believe that they went to the moon then, because that is impossible. A parabolic plane's parabola is usually about 30 seconds long. A parabolic plane cannot fly downward towards the Earth for 2.5 hours. It will crash. But of course I know that some people will say, well, the astronauts do go off screen and that's when the plane could have lifted up again or whatever. Okay, well then explain how the broadcast and the comms originated from the moon and not from the Earth. 600 million people were watching the live broadcast on their TV. Radio operators from all over the world were also listening in. And not a single radio operator proved that the origin of the signals came from the Earth. That right there is another piece of irrefutable proof that they were on the moon. That right there is a 10 out of 10 irrefutable fact. But in honor of Neil Armstrong, how about we go for a 13 out of 10 irrefutable fact? Do you know who else was listening in on the moon landings? The Soviet Union. Do you really think that if the Soviets detected some fuckery from NASA, that they would have said nothing about it? The Soviet Union understood space better than arguably anybody else at the time, and the only thing they ever said to America was congratulations. So that's a 13 out of 10. But of course, green codes. Green codes say that Russia and all the private ham radio operators all over the world were in on the hoax too. Just because. You see at this point how fucking dumb this is. But I'll debunk that claim a bit further later. So after Apollo 11 launched up from the moon, reconnected with the command module and returned to the Earth and safely splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, they were picked up by the recovery ship, the USS Hornet. They were then placed into quarantine. Here is Michael Collins talking about that on 60 Minutes Australia.
When you're up there, the three of you, you are very isolated from Earth. And then you land back on Earth. What was that like, being back?
There was a book, a novel published by John Steinbeck about this time, and the title of it was Of Mice and Men. And I was more interested in that point than I was in the mice than I was in the men. When we landed, we were put into quarantine for 2 weeks. We were in this gigantic laboratory sealed off with a colony of white mice. The reason was that some of our scientists were worried about the pathogens that we might have brought back from the moon. They possibly would be dangerous to humankind. So their solution to that, to ascertain it and to preserve their safety, was to put us inside a hermetically sealed container with a gigantic colony of white mice. The white mice lived, we were okay. White mice died, we were in deep trouble. So all I could think of was Steinbeck, Of Mice and Men. Yes, the mice are more important than the men, according to my conclusion.
And the mice survived?
The mice did beautifully, yes, thank you. Love those mice.
Well, that was good for you, I suppose.
That was, and of course I was checking on them. There were too many of them to give names to, but they became my friends. And in the meantime, the press outside was clamoring to know, wasn't I terribly lonely? And all I could think of was, let's talk about the white mice. I don't want loneliness, forget it. Let's talk white mice. Let's talk important stuff.
You just achieved the greatest feat in humanity, in humankind, and you were thinking about these mice.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So quarantine is pretty shit. We've all experienced it, but something that greencoats and grifters present as evidence is that at the conference with the Apollo 11 team after the landings, they say that Neil Armstrong is acting weird. Buzz Aldrin licks his lips a couple of times, and they fidget and play with their fingers, and Mike Collins just kinda stares past Neil Armstrong one time while he's talking. And this somehow means that they're lying. My God! Can you believe the audacity of NASA? Hiring skilled military test pilots and training them to be astronauts instead of just hiring fucking actors that could, act. Firstly, my opinion on body language analysis is that it's even less reliable than a polygraph test. You have human bias, and unless you know the person that you're analyzing very well, How the fuck can you presume to understand them well enough to understand what is out of character for them and what isn't? Secondly, Neil Armstrong was a famously shy and reserved person that didn't actually like all of the attention and fame he got from being the first man to walk on the moon. He didn't choose to be that person, he was assigned to be that person. Mike Collins said that he would have liked to have walked on the moon, but he was assigned to stay in the command module to rendezvous with the lunar module. So, these astronauts didn't actually have a choice, they didn't have a say in the matter. Now, I know this is incredibly hard for narcissists and egocentric sociopaths to understand, but not everybody wants to be the center of attention. And in the case of Neil Armstrong, he didn't like it. And if you think about it, actually use your brain and think about it. Most people have a hard time doing a classroom presentation in front of 30 other kids. Imagine speaking in front of the world. These are trained military test pilots, not professional public speakers. But I also want to point something out. I'm going to put some clips of the Apollo 11 conference on the left-hand side of the screen, and I'm going to put some clips of the Gemini 8 conference on the right-hand side of the screen, just so we can see how different Neil Armstrong acts. Gemini 8, by the way, was before the moon landings. Now, I'm not a qualified body language expert, but to be fair, no one in the world is, because that qualification does not exist. But to me, Neil Armstrong seems to be behaving the same way. And we can tell that he doesn't like being in front of a crowd of people, not by the way that he's acting, but because that's what people who knew him said about him. And I'm sure the people who actually knew him in real life, like his friends, family, and colleagues, knew him a lot better than we do. This fucking body language thing with the Apollo 11 press conference is the dumbest thing I have ever heard in my life. You don't know these people. But if we want to say that a couple of minutes towards the end is weird because they're all looking sort of sad and down or tired or whatever it may be, why don't we rewind to the beginning where they're actually laughing and joking and having a fucking good time on the stage?
And secondly, I think this question was asked, but I didn't get the complete answer. How do you propose to restore some normalcy to your private lives in the years ahead?
I wish I knew the answer to the latter part of your question.
Kind of depends on you. And the ascent was a great pleasure. It was very smooth. We were very, very pleased to have that engine light up. We enjoyed the ride more than we could say. Other item of interest in the very early stages of EVA, should it have been cut short for some unknown reason, was the job of bringing back a sample of the lunar rocks, and these photographs show the collection of that initial sample into a small bag, and then that bag being deposited in my pocket. This was the first of a number of times when we found two men were a great help. I quickly put up the TV camera. And then, more leisurely, but Buzz and I joined together to erect the American flag.
So many people have done so much to give us this opportunity to place this American flag on the surface. To me, it was one of the prouder moments of my life to be able to stand there and quickly salute the flag.
The rest of the activity seemed to go very rushed. There were a lot of things to do, and we had a hard time getting them finished.
Moment on the moon when either one of you were just a little bit spellbound by what was going on?
About 2.5 hours.
I'd like to ask Neil Armstrong when he began to think of what he would say when he put his foot down on the lunar surface, and how long he pondered this. the statement about a small step for man, gigantic leap for mankind.
Yes, I did think about it. It was not extemporaneous, neither was it planned. It evolved during the conduct of the flight, and I decided what the words would be while we were on the lunar surface just prior to leaving the landing.
I'd like to ask Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, and I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but when you first stepped on the moon, did it strike you as you were stepping on a piece of the Earth, or sort of what your inner feelings were, whether you felt you were standing in a desert, or this was really another world, or how you felt at that point?
Well, there was no question in our minds where we were. We'd been orbiting around the moon for quite a while.
And you know, I can keep going. I've got more clips of them laughing and cracking jokes, but I think you get the point. This fucking claim of these guys look sad and depressed and shit because they're being forced to lie it's the most brain dead thing I have ever heard. Because if you watch this conference, you will see all the examples of these guys laughing and cracking jokes. But we don't want to do that. We want to watch a 20-second short on YouTube or Instagram where some guy tells us something that's not true, and we just believe it because we want to believe in something stupid like this. We want to believe that the world is against us. We want to deny objective reality. Why don't you take any of those clips out of context and show them cracking jokes and laughing and shit and say, oh, look how funny they think it is lying to the world about the moon landings. You know, how about we just have some compassion? These three guys just came out of a grueling quarantine. Like literally just came out of it before this conference. And you're wondering why they're not smiling when you only watch about 2 or 3 30-second clips from it. Because you're too fucking lazy to watch the whole conference. Man, how about this? How about we each chip in $1 and we give that money to Brock Lesnar and we ask Brock Lesnar to just talk with all the moon landing deniers and see how long they're gonna keep denying the moon landing after that. Don't worry, I'm just kidding. He's not gonna talk with them. Violence isn't funny, that's true, but a suplex isn't violent. It's just a funny wrestling move. Look at how silly this man looks going over Brock Lesnar's head. He looks almost as silly as a moon landing denier. I'm truly sorry about how stupid my videos have become. But let's wrap this shit up. So after Apollo 11, there were 5 more trips to the moon. If this was all a hoax, Charlie Duke, the 10th man to walk on the moon, famously said,
"We went to the moon 9 times. You're gonna fake something, do it once and shut up."
A fine point, Mr. Charlie Duke. 10th man to walk on the moon and 10th man to ever earn the Mystorian's official pap of approval. I don't really think that statistic is accurate. I'm not sure how many paps I've given out. But I'd like to announce that I'm now retconning the pap of approval to now essentially be a knighthood of sorts. Therefore, Charlie Duke will now always be known as Sir Charlie Duke. Yeah. Cool. Back to business. Apollo 12 landed after them on November 19th, 1969. Apollo 13 had to be aborted because one of the main oxygen tanks in the service module exploded about 56 hours into the mission. Something that I still cannot fathom for the life of me why NASA would have faked. But more on that next time. Apollo 14 then landed on February 5th, 1971. Apollo 15 on July 30th, 1971. Apollo 16 featuring Sir Charlie Duke on April 21st, 1972. And last but not least, Apollo 17 on December 11th, 1972. And then NASA made the decision to stop going back. Not only because it was extremely expensive to put people on the moon for only a few hours, but they had also achieved their goal of beating the Soviets and putting a person on the moon.
The best NASA can do today is send mannequins to orbit the moon, when somehow we could play golf and drive cars on the moon with 1960s technology on the first attempt. There have been 6 presidents who have said a total of 9 times they're going to return to the moon, and 5 and they can't do it. With 50 years better technology, they can't return to the moon in 50 years. But
Why is that,
somehow
Charlie?
they could do it with 1960s technology on the first attempt.
Why don't you think we've been able to go back to the moon since 72?
Because they spent their money on other programs.
Well, the government spends every month 70% more money than they
Bart,
take
look,
in.
I'm not going to argue with you about this. We went to the moon. 6 times we landed on the moon.
You lied to the American public 6 times.
This guy stinks! What you just said is a complete delusion. It presumes that we went to the moon for science. It presumes that we went to the moon to explore it. But that's not why we went to the moon. We went to the moon because we were at war. Sputnik was not just some orbiting spacecraft. It was a hollowed out intercontinental ballistic missile where they took out the warhead and put in a radio transmitter. The military knew this. That's what founded NASA. NASA's budget for science it averaged over all these years about 25%. The rest has been for geopolitical purposes. All right? So it's the I don't want to die driver in this world. That's why we spent all this money. And so the moment we learn Russia's not going to the moon and it's certainly not going to Mars, we canceled the program. It had nothing to do with public interest.
So I think we've proven that the moon landings were real. And somehow, I still have 10 pages of script left, because there is just so much evidence that it happened. Now, these other 10 pages are basically just my top 10 reasons I think it would have been impossible to fake the moon landings. Now, each of these reasons, individually, I believe can be rated as a 13 out of 10 irrefutable fact. But we'll do all of that in a part 3, and then I will never talk about the moon landings again. Because our job is done. Anyways, I hope you had fun. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video, and let's end this video off by hearing Brian Cox swear one more time. Because that was amazing.
You can fucking sing it.
It's like music to my ears. Well, anyway, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.